Story number 1. If you haul heavy freight down the Pacific Northwest corridor, you learn to respect the mountains. The old logging routes winding through the deep valleys of Oregon are unforgiving, especially when the coastal fog rolls in, thick enough to swallow your high beams whole. It was late October, right around 2:45 a.m., and I was running a rush delivery payload of raw, industrial timber down a state route that locals call the Ghost Lane. The road is a narrow, crumbling two-lane highway flanked by sheer rock walls on one side and a drop-off into a black river canyon on the other. My rig was a classic Peterbilt, loaded down with 80,000 pounds of freshly cut logs. The weight behind me was massive, forcing me to creep down the steep mountain grades in low gear, my eyes locked onto the faint yellow lines of the road. About 30 miles from the nearest town, my air pressure gauge started acting erratically. The warning buzzer didn't go off, but the needle was dancing, suggesting a small leak in the primary reservoir line. If your air brakes fail on a 6% mountain descent with a full load of timber, you aren't going to make it to the bottom. I needed to pull over immediately to check the connections. Up ahead, my headlights caught a small, gravel-strewn emergency turnout. It was a jagged cutout in the mountain, completely unlit, shadowed by towering ancient Douglas firs that blocked out what little moonlight was left. I rolled the heavy rig into the gravel, the stones crunching violently under the massive weight, and pulled the yellow air valve knob to set the parking brakes with a loud, echoing hiss. The transition from the open road to the pitch-black turnout was suffocating. The mountain walls seemed to press in from all sides, and the dense fog was drifting across my windshield like gray smoke. I kept the engine running, popped my door lock, and grabbed my heavy steel tire thumper and a flashlight. Stepping out onto the running board, the freezing mountain air hit me like a slap. I walked down the driver's side of the long flatbed trailer, shining the light toward the air hoses connecting the cab to the trailer lines. The red and blue coiled glad hands looked secure, but as I leaned closer to listen for the telltale whistling of escaping air, a completely different sound cut through the darkness. It wasn't a mechanical hiss. It was the distinct, heavy sound of metal chains rattling directly underneath the log stacks. My heart did a sudden, violent flip. The massive logs were secured by thick, heavy-duty transport chains ratcheted down to thousands of pounds of pressure. They shouldn't be moving at all. I stepped back, aiming the flashlight beam up into the gaps between the massive wooden logs. The light flickered across the rough, bark-covered timber. Everything looked normal. But then a dark liquid began dripping rapidly from the center of the log stack, splattering onto the silver aluminum frame below. It wasn't hydraulic fluid. It wasn't oil. It was thick, dark, and steaming slightly in the freezing mountain air. I stepped closer, holding my finger out to catch a single drop, and brought it to my nose. The sharp, iron smell of fresh, warm blood filled my senses, making my stomach turn instantly. I stood paralyzed in the gravel, my flashlight beam shaking violently against the dripping timber. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to the cab, but my eyes were locked onto the narrow, pitch-black gaps between the heavy logs. I slowly raised the flashlight beam higher, aiming it deep into a small cavity where 4 massive tree trunks met. The white light cut through the shadows, and my breath caught instantly in my throat. Squeezed into a space no wider than 2 feet was a human torso. But it wasn't a hitchhiker, and it wasn't a body that had been hidden there at the logging yard. The skin was a pale, sickly gray, and it was moving. The torso was twisting with an impossible elastic flexibility, shifting itself forward through the narrow gaps like a spider squeezing out of a wall crevice. "Who's in there?" I choked out, backing away slowly, my boots sliding on the loose gravel. The moment I spoke, the wet breathing stopped. 2 long, impossibly thin arms reached out from the darkness of the log stack. The fingers were elongated, ending in jagged, cracked fingernails that dug deep into the pine bark, tearing the wood apart with terrifying strength. Slowly, a head emerged from the crevice. The face was long, distorted, and completely hairless. Its eyes were massive, milky white spheres that had no pupils, reflecting my flashlight beam like a deer caught in high beams. It had no nose, just 2 raw, vertical slits, and its mouth was stretched into a wide, toothless grin that split its face almost from ear to ear. It let out a high-pitched, clicking screech, and with a violent, jerky motion, it began dragging its elongated body out of the logs, dropping heavily onto the metal trailer frame right in front of me. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the air leak, the logs, or the truck. I sprinted for the driver's side cab like a madman, dropping my tire thumper into the snow. Behind me, I could hear a terrifying, rapid scratching sound. The creature was scrambling over the metal flatbed, its long limbs clicking against the steel frame as it chased me. I grabbed the chrome handle, threw myself into the seat, and slammed the heavy door shut, hitting the lock cylinder. Just a fraction of a second before, something heavy slammed against the outside glass. Through the window, the pale, distorted face was pressed flat against the glass, its milky eyes staring directly into mine, its elongated fingers scratching at the weather stripping with frantic, animalistic hunger. I didn't care about the air pressure. I smashed my foot down on the clutch, slammed the transmission into gear, and stomped the accelerator. The massive Peterbilt lunged forward, the rear tires spinning wildly in the gravel before catching the asphalt of the main highway. The sudden jerk of the truck threw the creature off the door, and through my side mirror, I watched it tumble into the dark fog of the turnout. It didn't stop. It immediately rose on all fours, its long limbs moving in a sickening insect-like crawl, sprinting down the center of the highway right behind my trailer, easily keeping pace with my accelerating rig. I buried the needle into the dashboard, pushing the 80,000-pound truck faster than it had ever gone down a mountain descent. The trailer was swaying violently around the sharp curves, the logs groaning under the pressure. But I didn't let up on the gas until the dense forest finally gave way to the bright neon lights of a commercial truck stopped 20 miles away. The police searched the log stack when I arrived, but they found nothing but deep, clawed gouges in the pine bark and a thick trail of dark, cold blood that ended at the back edge of the flatbed. I quit the logging routes the next day. Now I only haul dry vans on major, well-lit interstates. But every time I drive through a thick fog bank, or hear the rhythmic clinking of cargo chains shifting behind my head, I look at my side mirror, terrified that I'll see those milky, pupilless eyes staring back at me from the dark. Story number 2. There is a specific kind of dread that only hits you when you realize you're completely cut off from civilization. When you're driving a modern automated rig, you trust the tech, the GPS, the satellite radio, the digital route planners. They give you a sense of safety. But 3 months ago, on a desolate stretch of Nevada desert near Route 50, I learned that technology can be a trap. It was precisely 3:10 a.m., and I was running a solo cross-country route, hauling a high-priority, 40,000-pound payload of high-density, lithium-ion batteries meant for a tech production facility in Reno. The desert at night is a void. There are no lights, no houses, and no signs of life for 50 miles in any direction. Just an endless expanse of cracked earth and twisted sagebrush under a starless sky. I was cruising on autopilot when the central navigation screen suddenly went black. A second later, a bright red warning popped up on the primary dashboard cluster. Critical system fault, sensor isolation, pull over immediately. At the exact same moment, the truck's electric drive motors cut power entirely. The rig began losing speed rapidly, coasting on its own momentum. I gripped the steering wheel, guiding the dying 40-ton vehicle off the dark asphalt and onto the soft, dusty shoulder of the road. The truck rolled to a complete stop, the automated emergency electronic brakes engaging with a dull, heavy click. The silence that followed was absolute. The digital dashboard was completely dead, leaving the cab illuminated only by the cold, faint blue glow of my personal smartphone. I sat there in the dark cab for a long minute, trying to reboot the main breaker panel, but the entire electrical architecture of the truck was completely unresponsive. I looked down at my phone. The cellular signal bar was spinning frantically before settling on a cold, definitive, no service. I was completely stranded in the dead zone of the high desert. According to company protocol, if a high-value lithium payload is stranded, the driver must perform a manual inspection of the external battery coolant lines on the side of the trailer to ensure there is no fire hazard. I grabbed my tactical flashlight from the center console, unlatched the heavy driver's side door, and stepped down onto the desert dirt. The air was freezing, dry, and smelled faintly of dust and ozone. I shone my flashlight down the long white side of the trailer, walking toward the central maintenance panel. The white beam cut cleanly through the desert darkness, illuminating the pristine, bolted steel of the cargo container. Everything looked perfectly intact. I reached the panel, popped the heavy dual latches, and swung the metal door open to check the digital pressure gauges inside. But the gauges weren't reading a normal pressure cycle. The small digital screens were flickering wildly, displaying a series of strange, repetitive symbols that looked like ancient geometric runes rather than numbers. As I stared at the corrupted display in utter confusion, a loud, heavy thud vibrated through the metal frame of the trailer, coming from the very top of the cargo box. My heart instantly raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stepped back from the panel, raising my flashlight beam up to the roofline of the trailer. The white light illuminated the smooth white aluminum top, but there was nothing there, just the empty desert sky above it. Then my smartphone clicked loudly in my pocket. It was the distinct sound of an incoming text message notification. That was impossible. The phone had absolutely no cell service or satellite connection. Shaking, I pulled the device out of my pocket. The screen showed an unknown, unlisted number. I tapped the message open, and the breath left my lungs completely. It was a picture, a crystal-clear, high-definition photograph taken from the roof of my truck's cab, looking down through the glass sunroof directly at the empty driver's seat. Before my brain could even process what I was looking at, a second message flashed onto the screen. It was text, "Look up, Mark." My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone into the dirt. I didn't want to do it. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to run out into the empty desert, to flee into the darkness. But my head moved on its own, slowly tilting backward as I aimed my flashlight beam up at the roof of the cab. Crouched directly on top of the fiberglass air deflector was a dark, thin shape. It looked like a man, but its limbs were long, skeletal, and wrapped in a tight, oily black fabric that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface of black glass where a human face should be. But as I watched, the glass surface began to glow faintly, displaying the exact same digital runes that were flickering on my trailer's maintenance panel. It wasn't an animal and it wasn't a man. It was something else, something that had completely hijacked my truck's electronics just to draw me out into the open. The creature didn't launch itself at me. Instead, it slowly raised one long, skeletal arm and pointed directly at the open maintenance panel of my trailer. A third text message hissed onto my phone screen. "Disconnect the refrigeration core, now." If I pulled the manual breaker, the cooling systems for the lithium batteries would shut down completely. Within 20 minutes, the internal temperature would spike, triggering a massive, uncontrollable chemical thermal runaway that would detonate the entire 40,000-pound payload like a bomb, destroying the truck and everything within a half-mile radius. But as the creature leaned forward over the edge of the cab roof, the smooth glass of its face shifted, displaying a live video feed of my own home, showing my children asleep in their beds, with a tiny red digital crosshair hovering directly over my son's chest. They weren't after the cargo. They wanted a catastrophe, and they knew exactly how to make me execute it. With tears streaming down my face and a hollow scream trapped in my throat, I reached into the maintenance panel, grabbed the heavy copper emergency breaker lever, and pulled it down with all my weight. A loud electrical arc popped in the dark, and the cooling pumps died instantly. The creature on the roof nodded slowly, its glass face going dark. It turned, leaping off the back of the cab with impossible grace, and vanished into the pitch-black desert night without a sound. I didn't wait for the temperature to spike. I ran to the cab, threw myself inside, and found that the dashboard had miraculously surged back to life. I slammed the truck into gear and drove like a maniac, tearing down the empty highway, while the trailer behind me began to hiss and bellow thick, toxic white smoke into the desert air. I made it exactly 3 miles before the primary battery packs detonated. A massive blinding orange fireball, tearing the trailer completely apart and throwing the cab forward into the ditch. I survived the crash, but the logistics company and the federal investigators never believed my story about the creature or the text messages. The intense thermal explosion had completely vaporized my phone and the truck's central data loggers. They ruled it a driver error and a mechanical failure. I was blacklisted from the industry, my career completely ruined. I live in a small apartment now, working a basic security job, keeping my windows locked every single night. But every time my television screen flickers with digital static, or my phone displays an unknown number, I feel that cold desert wind on my neck. Because I know they are still watching, and they know exactly what it takes to make me break. Please subscribe and like the video to support the channel. Thank you.